me start with you. What am I getting wrong here?
I don't think you're necessarily getting anything wrong. I just think you need to look at it from a different lens. The truth of the matter is, when we look at voter ID, it prohibits a certain group of the population not to be able to engage in the civic process as opposed to others. The truth is, 8% of white Americans do not have a driver's license as opposed to 21% of Black Americans. So there is going to be a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And you may say, well, why don't Black Americans or some of them have different forms of ID? Well, we know during the Jim Crow era, a lot of Black people were not allowed to get birth certificates. So they don't necessarily have the paperwork or the documentation needed to get the ID required to vote. So what I think that we need to understand is that voting should be allowed to all Americans. And voting should not be made harder. It should be made easier. And so whenever rules and regulations are put in place to make them harder, then we have to raise our eyebrows and say, well, why is that so?
Do you have examples of people who want to be able to get IDs, who are American citizens, who simply can't?
Absolutely. There's people who don't have access to their birth certificates. Even if we look at the indigenous
But they're usually alternative ways you can go about demonstrating it.
Not necessarily. Even if you look at the indigenous population, a lot of the people from that demographic are born at home or they're born on native land. So they don't have the necessary documentation needed to get a state ID. And then the documentation in which they do have sometimes is not accepted. So there are ways in which this can impact people. I mean, 13 to 18 million Americans do not have appropriate ID. So this is not a one-shot thing. This is affecting millions of Americans. And again, if we want people to be engaged in the civic process, then we have to make it easier for them to do so.
Steve Cortes.
Dan, this whole idea that minorities are somehow incapable of obtaining ID, it is a smear, it's offensive, and it is ludicrous. There is nothing consequential in life that you can do without identification, from getting married to renting a car. And the idea that I, as an Hispanic, just because I'm named Cortez, or just because somebody has black skin, that they are incapable of furnishing ID is actually the ultimate form of bigotry. That is ridiculous. It's offensive. And here's the other aspect of it that is so dangerous for America. There's no logical reason why we shouldn't require ID, right? There's no honest, logical reason. So then we have to consider, well, what are the dishonest reasons? And for those of us on the right, we are naturally and correctly suspicious that what the leftists in places like California actually want is a lot of people who are not valid voters, who are not, for example, American citizens or are felons, to be able to vote. And particularly in an era of an open border under Kamala Harris, where more than 10 million illegal migrants have poured into this country. And we know factually that there are leftist groups out there, outside groups, not the Kamala Harris campaign, but outside groups who are trying to communicate to them that they are actually allowed to vote, when in fact they are not. And that is a very real concern in a state like California, where you're actually explicitly telling them you can't check IDs.
Yeah, but look, I hear you on the California piece, but in a lot of the battlegrounds, we're hearing this, right, from the right. People saying, oh, you know, they're trying to get people who aren't legal to vote. And yet you hear from every Secretary of State. I just talked to Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, for example, and they'll tell you that it's just not happening. It's not a reality, that this is being made up by the right, that this idea that, oh, all these people who are here illegally are trying to vote.
Okay, but how would they know? That's the point. Particularly
because
in
they're
states
checking.
Where in some of the no, hold on, Dan. In some of these states that are blue states, yet they are swing states, but run by blue governors, places like Michigan and Pennsylvania, all the northern ones, and Wisconsin, where voters are being registered simply because they get IDs, because they get driver's licenses, which by law are furnished to illegal migrants or at least non-citizens who are in this country, some of whom are actually allowed to be here but are not yet allowed to vote. So they would never show up, in other words, as a fraudulent vote, because they have a driver's license and because they are actually officially on the voter rolls, even though they don't belong there.
They're not on the voter rolls. They're not on the voter rolls. They're on the license rolls. But they're not. Wisconsin is a great example.
In many states they are. And Dan, look, you even brought this up yourself. Look, I lived in Chicago most of my adult life. I would try to furnish an ID, right? I would try to show them one. It was refused every single time through dozens of cycles. Somebody easily could have come in and said, I'm Steve Cortes and I'm here to vote.
Let me let Wendy
absolutely
respond.
Could have happened, and it's naive to think that it doesn't happen.
Wendy?
I think what is naive is exactly what Steve is saying, is this attempt at fear mongering from the right to try to make it seem like there's a swath of people who are coming in to try to vote, or these illegals who are trying to vote and swing the election to the left. That is not the case. What is the case is that the right is trying to make it harder for Black and brown people to vote. The right is trying to find ways and loopholes to try to make it so Democrats cannot vote.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find News Nation on your screen. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.